Without further ado, we are very excited to present Dan Werthimer. Dan Werthimer is a chief scientist of the Berkeley SETI Research Center, co-founder of SETI at Home, and the principal investigator of CASPER, the Center for Astronomy, Signal Processing, and Electronics Research. Dan has testified to Congress about SETI, holds the Drake Award for SETI Research, and the Carl Sagan Award for Science Education, and published 250 papers. He is the editor of Bioastronomy, Molecules, Microbes, and Extraterrestrial Life, as well as Astronomical and Biochemical Origins in the Search for Life in the Universe. Dan was in the Homebrew Computer Club with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Very cool. Everyone in that club became ultra rich except Dan. I assume there's supposed to be some sort of frowny face emoji at the very end of that, but our lives are at least more enriched for having you around here. So, if you would please take it away.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for coming today. So, I was in this homebrew computer club. The very first chips had come out, and they were made to replace mechanical cash registers. For those of you who are old enough, you might remember the cash registers didn't used to be electronic. They had like gears and pulleys and stuff like that when you checked out your groceries. And this company in Japan that made calculators came up with that chip. And the homebrew computer club was a group of kids in the Bay Area, mostly high school kids. And we thought we could use those chips to make the first home computers. And Wozniak and Jobs were there, and I was there, and there were like 50 of us that built these early computers with these first chips that were meant to be just to replace cash registers. But we made the first spreadsheets and word processors and operating systems. And the reason I'm not rich is because I was interested in astronomy and this question, are we alone? And I tried to think of how ways we could use those chips to do astronomy. So I came to grad school here like about 100 years ago, and I started working on SETI and pulsars and stuff like that I'll tell you a little bit about. So I'm not rich in kind of a financial way, but I think it enriched my life, and it's a lot of fun to be at Berkeley working on this kind of stuff. So the question I want to talk to you about is, are we alone? Is anybody out there? And you probably know it's called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And let's see, that it's not supposed to pop up. Shoot. Can you give me a hand with this again?
It seems their internet connection is a little bit unstable.
I can't. Maybe I can advance the slides. Oh, okay. Maybe I can't. Okay, I just can't see it on my screen anymore. But that's okay. I can just look up there. Shoot.
Just that your internet is a little bit unstable.
Oh, is that what's going on? Okay. Yeah, we can't figure out the technology here. We're not going to be able to find the TM. Okay, so first I'm just going to give you a little background about life in the universe, and then I'm going to talk about searches that we and other people have done, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the new things are that we're working on and the future of SETI. So I want to start off with this question about, are we alone? And no, now I can't fast forward the slide. I can't forward the slides anymore. Shoot. I'm sorry. I got a technology experts. What's happening? Oh, you can. What did you do?
Arrow keys.
Sorry?
Arrow keys.
Okay. So this guy named Frank Drake, who died last year, and he came up with this thing called the Drake equation. And the Drake equation is a way to figure out how many civilizations there are in our galaxy that we could communicate with. And on the left there is the number of civilizations, and all you got to do is multiply those different numbers on the right. And the problem with this equation is we don't have any idea what any of those numbers are. It's a way to kind of organize your thoughts about a big question, are we alone, and break it down into little questions that we can start thinking about. And the way the Drake equation works is that it's about how many stars there are in the galaxies, and the next factor is, are there planets, how many planets there are, and the next factor, E, is for environment, so the little S sub P is about planets, the N sub E is about environment, like does the planets have good environments, like do they have the water and the things, chemicals that we need to make life, And then the next factor, F sub L, is for life. Like if you have a planet with a good environment, how often do you get life? And so it's this kind of whittling down process. You start with stars, then you say how many planets are there, and then you say, well, how many good planets are there with the right environment? And they say, well, of the good planets, how many of those get life? And then the next factor is intelligence. Like once you get primitive life, you get intelligence. And the next factor is, do they develop C, F sub C is like the fraction that develop communication. So once you get life, then you get intelligence. How many of those have communication technology, so we could talk with radio or lasers or some way to talk with them? And the last factor, L, of the Drake equation is how long do they live? What's the longevity of a civilization? As soon as they develop radio and lasers, do they blow themselves up? Did they invent genetic engineering and AI? And so our sun is going to live, well, our sun's been around about 5 billion years. It's going to be around another few billion years. So, and some stars are 10 billion years old. And so, sorry, is that okay? I think so.
Turn that off.
Take it off, turn it off. Okay, I'm going to turn this off. Is that something I was doing? Just bad. Okay, so can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't know how long our civilization is going to live, but it could last another few billion years while we're still going around this star, and we could move to another star, and those stars might last tens of billions of years. So we could last a long time if we learn to figure out how to live together and get through the next election. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about each one of these factors before I talk to you about how we're going to find out, are we alone? But the main thing I want to get across in this equation, we really don't know. You can't solve this problem theoretically. You can't just calculate what each one of these factors are and know the answer to the question, are we alone? You've got to really go out and look. It's an experimental thing. You got to go to a telescope. You're going to have to do observational stuff. But I do want to talk about these factors anyway, because it's kind of interesting. So the first factor, well, actually, the first factor was about how many stars there are. There are a couple 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. But the next factor you might remember is about how many planets are going around and those stars. And wow, it keeps, what did you say? Go ahead, Control B. Control, what's the magic incantation to get this Zoom thing go away? Oh, okay, maybe I'll just stop looking at my screen and just look up here. I'm sorry, little technology problems.
Internet's being a bit techy.
Oh, that's what's going on. I don't have a good connection or something.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so if you would ask me, or any astronomer 25 years ago, are there planets going on other stars? We only knew about the planets going around our star, 8 or 9 planets, depending on which politics you believe in. So the problem is, the reason we didn't know 25 years ago other planets going on other stars, because the planets are little dinky things, and they're right next to these really bright things. So 1 million Earths could fit inside our sun, and the planets are right next to this incredibly bright thing. It's like looking for a firefly next to a searchlight. It's kind of a difficult problem. And the way they were found at first was something called the wiggle method. Not by looking at you can't see the planet itself, but when the planet goes around the star wiggles a little bit. They're pulling on each other gravitationally. And if you see a wiggling star, that betrays the presence of a planet. You actually, the first way they found is that when the star is moving toward you, it does this thing called a blue shift. It gets the colors shift a little bit, they get bluer, and when the star is moving away from you, it gets a little redder, called a red shift. This is a plot. Boy, I can't switch the star. What am I doing wrong here? You have to reconnect for me every time. Do I need to do something? Maybe you better sit right here.
Yeah, good idea. I think that's good.
Okay, or teach me how to do what you're doing. Okay, so this is a particular one of the early systems that was found, and you can see here it's actually kind of got 2 wiggles. It's got a fast wiggle. See if you can see my cursor kind of going up and down, and then it's also got this slow wiggle. That's because this star has 2 planets going around, one more slowly that's further away and a fast one. There's a newer way to find planets. Maybe some of you know about this. By the way, a lot of this work about finding the first planets was done here at Berkeley. And Berkeley continues to be a leader in this thing called exoplanets, learning about how many stars have planets and what kind of planets there are. So the next technique, instead of the wiggle method, is called the occultation plan. So I don't know if you can see that little black dot in front of the star. But when a planet gets in front of a star, the starlight is dimmed a little bit. It blocks some of the light. Not very much, right? Because the planet's very small, if you can see that little black dot. So Kepler was basically a camera that took pictures of 100,000 stars, and it looked for stars that were dimming a little bit. And it's a camera in space because it turns out if you do it on the ground from a ground-based telescope, stars twinkle because the atmosphere, it looks like they're getting brighter and dimmer, and you think there's a planet, but it's actually the atmosphere just making it twinkle. But if you go in space and you see a star dimming, especially if it dims periodically, you know, once every 2 years or 4 years or something like that, then you know something's going around in a periodic way, like our sun goes. Anyway, so Kepler found thousands of planets, and now we know that most stars have planets, and there are more planets than there are stars, like maybe 5 or 10 times more planets than there are stars. And a lot of the planets are little dinky things like Earth. The big ones were the early ones. The big planets they're easier to find. So those are the ones we found first, like Jupiter, Saturn-sized things, even bigger. But now we can find Earth-sized things, or even a little bit smaller than Earth-sized. And a lot of them are in the Goldilocks zone. You don't want to be too close to your star. It's kind of hot there. You don't want to be too far away. It's kind of cold there. Life as we know it anyway. But there's this Goldilocks zone. And we found a lot of planets in the Goldilocks zone. So it looks like there are lots of planets. We now know that there's liquid water there, a lot of the chemicals that you need, complicated molecules, amino acids, things like that. So we know there are a lot of places for life. So the next thing, oh, by the way, as you go down the Drake equation, it gets more and more unknown. Like when Frank Drake wrote the equation, the only thing we knew about was how many stars there were. But now we know about planets. The next thing, though, we don't really know. The next thing is how often does life get started? Now, the primordial soup, we really don't know what was in the primordial soup or how. But people have done experiments about this, and what they did was this was actually done at Berkeley. They put in the conditions that were around 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth was forming. We knew there was methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen. They put that in a flask. They put lightning. They had sparks fly, and you kind of simulate the early conditions, what was around when Earth was forming. You don't get gorillas crawling around this thing, but what they were able to do was make the amino acids the basic building blocks of life. And that happened fairly quickly. And life got started on Earth very quickly. As soon as Earth cooled down, it looks like life popped up. So we think that, we don't really know for sure, but at least on Earth, because it happened quickly, we think that even though we don't understand all the chemistry and how that all happened, just because it happened quickly on Earth, there are probably a lot of places where this kind of simple life, single-celled creatures happened. Just kind of based on the time that it took here on Earth, we can sort of make a rough estimate with Bayesian statistics. You can say there are probably a lot of planets with simple life on it. But we really don't know. The next factor we really have no idea is, like, once you get simple life, you get intelligence. And that actually happens several times on Earth. There seems to be selection pressure, evolution. There are lots of ways to succeed in Darwinian evolution. You can run fast or have a hard shell or be radiation tolerant, but one way to succeed in life, especially in complex environments, is to have a big brain and think about different scenarios and try to evade things that are going to eat you and figure out how to get food. So it's good to have a big brain, and that's happened several times on Earth. There are several things that have brains bigger than humans, and some people think maybe even more intelligent than humans. Dolphins and whales have bigger brains, more sophisticated brains, but they use a lot of it for sonar. But it's probably likely that if we manage to blow ourselves up, some species will quickly, in a million or 2 million years, pretty quick time scale, kind of take our place, we think. There may be life in our own backyard. So this is a moon going around Jupiter called Europa, and it's got a liquid ocean. The blue stuff here is an ocean, and maybe there's something swimming around down there. It's actually going to be hard to figure out because the liquid water is covered by ice. It's about 30 miles thick. That white stuff there in that cutaway view is ice. And we're trying to figure out how to get through the ice. And sometimes I go to middle schools and elementary schools and I talk about this and I ask the kids, how are we going to get through the ice? And the boys, they want to use machine guns and bombs. The girls are a little more sophisticated. They want to like melt their way through. Well, there was a 12-year-old girl, she said, okay, take a small automatic submarine and coat the hull with thermopiles. Thermopiles are things that make electricity from a difference in temperature. So if the submarine is warm and the ice that you're melting through is cold, you can make electricity and use that to kind of melt your way through the ice. That was pretty cool. And so maybe there is a future for Earthlings. And okay, I can't change slides. What is the magic incantation? I lost connection again. Sorry, we're trying to make this available to remotely, and I think my internet connection, should we hook up a cable or something? We would you'll just have to come every once in a while. Okay, change the orientation of the, okay. I think that's where I want to be. Anyway, we don't know how to get through the ice, but it turns out there's another moon that's going around Saturn called Enceladus. And the cool thing about Enceladus is the ice has got it's got liquid ocean, but it's covered with ice, but the ice is cracks, and you can see the fissures there, and it's got like geysers, plumes coming out. So maybe you don't have to get through the ice. Maybe you could fly a spacecraft through the plume and sample, and maybe you could detect primitive life in the plume. If we find life on Enceladus or Europa or something in our own backyard, that means that if we find in our own backyard, that means life is everywhere. So that'll be pretty exciting. There won't be advanced life. There won't be, mammals and things like that. But primitive life, we might find it. There's another way to find it remotely on a distant planet. You can take a spectrum of the atmosphere. We don't know how to do this now, but we will know how to do it in 20 years. Take the spectrum of the atmosphere, learn what gases are in the atmosphere. And if you see oxygen on an exoplanet, that might indicate photosynthesis. So we can detect plant life remotely, primitive life. Okay, what about this question about intelligence and could we communicate with ET? So that field is called SETI. That's what I've done a good chunk of my life. I haven't bagged any aliens. I'm kind of motivated by the parking permit outside. You get the Nobel laureate, IET. It's a really nice parking space right in front of the astronomy building. So I want to give you there. I'm not the first person to do ET. It happened again. Should I? You want to just stay here for the whole talk? Should I try to reorient the laptop? Or okay, I might just keep calling you. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm not the first person to work on SETI. This guy Gauss, 200 years ago, Gauss, a mathematician, suggested that we make large geometric structures on the planet that ET could see it. Maybe a big right triangle made of pine trees, 3, 4, 5 miles on the side, big square of dirt, big square of water, big square of wheat. ET would look down with their good telescope and see that we knew about the Pythagorean theorem. Maybe they would get in touch. It was a really cool idea. Unfortunately, it's not funny. Von Littron, also a couple hundred years ago, he suggested we dig a circular ditch 20 miles across, fill the ditch with kerosene, use this match, not the scale, make a bright ring of light, a bright ring of fire, and ET would see this bright circle of light and get in touch. And then with a similar fate. Charles Crow, he suggested also 200 years ago, that we use mirrors to reflect sunlight to the Martians, and actually several mirrors. You can see one in Paris and the others to outline the bright dots, and ET would see these bright dots, the shape of the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, and maybe they would get in touch. I think you can guess what happened with that project. The first funded project was to send pornography into space. Some of you might know this. It's the plaque on the Pioneer 10 spacecraft, and you can see at the bottom of the plaque the solar system, the sun on the left, and then Mercury and Venus, and then Earth, and you can see the spacecraft leaving the Earth as it's already going out into the stars. It'll take a few million years to get to a star. It's going, just 30,000 miles an hour, kind of slow. So it takes a while to get to the nearest star. But I think it's the first spacecraft that went outside of our solar system. And in case ET finds it, it's got a little plaque on it, and it's got a picture of you and me. And they'll know how big we are because we're standing next to the spacecraft, the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. And then a lot of arguments about what genitalia should be shown or what not should be shown. And then the thing on the left, at the left of the spacecraft, is a little map that has directions to pulsars and how fast they go, so they'll know where we live and they come eat us if they want. And it's connecting again. Shoot, I'm really sorry about this. What should we do? Do we just keep doing this over and over again?
Yeah.
Okay, so can I will it help can I just go through the slides again, or am I disconnected from Zoom? Well, if people can't see these.
We can position the camera on him and also.
Oh yeah, why don't they just use that thing? What if we just don't connect these?
It's not as clear imaging, but
It's not as quick.
Thank you for being with us with technical bit.
Could we just not have my thing
Yeah,
connected?
you're set up to go now.
I'm set up to go?
Yeah.
Should I leave the meeting then?
Don't.
I think I should, right? Okay, oh, you killed me. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so that was the first. Meeting. Okay, so I'm sorry, so we're gonna make a little sacrifice for the people who are watching the remote. They're not gonna see my screen, but they're gonna see that screen because there's a camera on that screen. But you guys will be better off. The people who are here are gonna be better off. The people remote are gonna suffer a little bit, but they're okay. So okay, so that was the first funded project. I mentioned this project where kind of in the future, we don't know how to do this now, but to take the spectrum of the atmosphere of an exoplanet, and you can detect this thing called the chlorophyll bump. And you can detect if there are plants on a remote thing. Another thing you can do is look for this thing called a Dyson sphere. That Freeman Dyson said a really advanced civilization might build a sphere around their star to collect all the energy hitting their star. A guy named Kardashev talked about how much energy civilizations use. We're kind of Kardashev scale 0. We just use a little bit of energy coming from the sun. But you could imagine a civilization that harnesses all the energy hitting their planet, like covers their planet with solar cells or something like that. Or the next level is like building a shell around your star, so you get all the energy that's leaving the star, not just the energy that's hitting your planet. The next level is you build a shell around all the stars in the galaxy. And that's then it goes on from there, like all the galaxies, you get all the, and then you get all the energy in the multiverse. Anyway, so if you want to search for Dyson spheres, we've done this at Berkeley, and other people have done this. That if you build a big shell around your star, it turns out the shell gets warm and it radiates a lot of infrared energy. And you can look for stars that have excess of infrared heat energy. We haven't found any yet, but people are looking, and we have better catalogs to do that. That would take a very advanced civilization. What if you want to detect civilizations that don't have the kind of technology like building Dyson spheres? We might be able to do that in 1,000 years or something. Well, it turns out Earthlings are emitting radio signals, and we've been sending television now for about 80 years. This is a plot of television power leaving the Earth as a function of time, and we're getting brighter and brighter all the time. The early television shows that left the Earth have now gone past about 10,000 stars. So the early shows like I Love Lucy and Sullivan, those shows are way out there. And the nearby stars have seen The Simpsons. And Earthlings have even sent intentional messages. This is very controversial whether you should send messages out into space, but it's been done a few times. I don't think this is a good idea because maybe they'll come and eat us and we don't really know what's out there. I think we should just listen at first and learn more about our universe before we start deliberately transmitting. But people have done this. And one of the ideas is to send pictures. And this was a picture sent in the 70s. Luckily, it was sent to a globular cluster that's 25,000 light years away. So it's going to be 25,000 light years to get this radio message out there. And if they want to reply, it'll take 25,000 years to get it back here. So I've set my clock. But some people want to transmit to the nearby stars, which are just a few light years away. So they might be eating us in 10 years or something like that. Anyway, on this thing, there's a picture of a human that you can see in red. There's a picture of a solar system in yellow there. You see the sun and Mercury and Venus, and then Earth is tipped toward the person. Next to the person on the right is the population of the world at the time it was sent. Then you can see a DNA molecule above the person, the amino acids that the DNA is made of. I forgot. Anyway, and at the bottom is the telescope and the size of the telescope that sent it. So anyway, we think pictures are kind of a universal creature, so we'll be able to perceive their environment in 2 or 3 dimensions, and maybe they use sonar, maybe they use ultraviolet or something, but they'll have some kind of way to interpret 2 or 3 dimensional images, we think. So we've been sending out this stuff. So what could they be sending out something? So one possibility is they might have some kind of artifact that wasn't intended for us. They haven't detected oxygen or our radio signals. They're not blasting something in our direction because they want to talk to us. But what if they just have an artifact like some radar signal? We have a lot of radar looking for incoming missiles from Russia and China, and we have radio and television leaving our Earth. Maybe they have something like that wasn't intended for interstellar communication, but we could intercept. Or maybe they know about us and they think we're interesting and they want to talk to us and they deliberately point something in our direction. So I mentioned here that the first civilization we contact is likely to be quite a bit ahead of us. It turns out we can't find these civilizations if they have primitive technology, like if they just invented fire or they're living in the ocean or they're plants. We can't detect them. So we've only had radio 100 years. We've only had lasers for 50 years. What's the chance that we'll detect them where they just invented radio and lasers? It's much more likely that they're somewhere in our future, maybe 1 billion or 2 billion years ahead of us. So anyway, I'm not the first guy. Tesla, Marconi, the early radio pioneers looked for these radio signals. The Navy in the 1920s looked for signals from Mars. Frank Drake, who did the Drake equation, did one of the early kind of searches in the 60s. At Berkeley, we have about 24 people that work on this question. They're not full time, and they're mostly astronomers, but also some of the students that work with me are from the engineering department because we build these complicated electronic kind of gizmos, which I'll tell you a little about. We build telescopes, and some of them are computer science students. Because we write a lot of code to process the data. And there are a lot of interesting engineering and computing challenges to do this. These are some of the people here at Berkeley that work on this. We are funded by the Breakthrough Foundation, National Science Foundation. We used to get money from NASA. Individuals help us out, and some companies donate some of the equipment we use. I mentioned the kind of main motivation here. So one of the problems is that if ET is transmitting a signal, we don't know where in the electromagnetic spectrum. Are they broadcasting in the FM band, the AM band? Are they sending optical signals? And so we use a lot of different telescopes, some optical, infrared telescopes, radio telescopes, look at different frequencies and start to probe the electromagnetic spectrum. But I would say Earthlings are kind of in this early phase where we're just beginning to learn about how we might detect other civilization. We're not doing a thorough search right now of the whole spectrum. We're just kind of learning how to do this kind of stuff. But the good news is that our capabilities are growing exponentially. One of the programs is called Breakthrough Listen, and it's got 3 radio telescopes and an optical telescope. One of these, the optical telescope at the top there is at Lick Observatory looking for laser signals. And then this one of the middle telescope is a radio telescope in West Virginia called Green Bank Telescope. And the next one at the bottom is in Australia because we want to look for if maybe ET's looking at is going to be hanging out in the southern part of the sky. So we want to use telescopes in the north and telescopes in the south. You got to go in the southern part of the sky to look at the center of the galaxy, and not many telescopes are in the southern part of the sky. So the first search that Berkeley did was funded by NASA. This is a search that I worked on when I was a graduate student here. And NASA requires that you use acronyms. So SERENIP is Search for Extraterrestrial Radio Emissions from Nearby Developed Intelligent Populations. And this was the first telescope we used. It's it's Hat Creek Observatory. It did belong to the University of California at the time. And this was a radio dish that we used to look for ET in the 70s and the early 80s. And while we were using the telescope, this is what happened to it. And that you can see the dish down here. And the pedestal is no longer there. And so then we said, okay, we can't use that telescope anymore. So we went to this telescope, which is even bigger. This is the 300-foot telescope. And while we're using that telescope to look for ET, this is what happened to that telescope. So then we started doing optical SETI at Lick telescope, and our optical SETI experiment almost burned down. You can see the fire came right up to our optical telescope at Lick Observatory, which is just a 2-hour drive from here in the mountains near San Jose. Then we went to this telescope, the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico. This was at the time the world's largest telescope. This is what happened to that telescope while we were using it. So why is this stuff always happening to Dan? Why do all the telescopes that Dan uses? So the answer, according to the World Weekly News, is that the aliens did not want to be discovered. They zapped the telescope, zapped by hostile space aliens. Actually, I don't think that is probably why these telescopes fell apart. This one, the Arecibo telescope, was quite old and the cables broke. The fire, I think that was a human fire, actually. This one, the bearing seized up, they forgot to oil it. And that one was 120-mile-an-hour wind. The telescope was designed for 100-mile-an-hour winds. Yeah. And it lasted about 60 years until the 120-mile-an-hour came up. Anyway, okay, so the first thing that we did with the original SERENIP equipment was just look for some strong signal. And the problem is you don't know what frequency they're going to be broadcasting on. So we looked at many different channels, or you can see here our channel number 2,264,191. And then at one of these channels, there's some strong signal. And I wish I could tell you we found ET, but it turned out that's a problem with the satellite that was going over the telescope. It's a big problem that you're looking for extraterrestrial radio signals, but what you find are things caused by humans, terrestrials. It's called radio frequency interference, radio pollution. And it's getting worse and worse. In some bands, we just can't work in. If ET's broadcasting in that band, in a TV band or a cell phone band, we're never going to find it because there's too much pollution there. And the Earth is getting a harder and harder place to work. All these bands are starting to fill up. We may eventually have to go to the backside of the moon or something. The moon would act like a big shield. That'd be a very expensive thing to do, but we may have to do that eventually. So that was the simplest thing to look for. Then we want to look for more complicated signals. These are signals that are changing in frequency. This one's going, or you can see another one coming out. I can't whistle anyway. And you can see that with your eye, but we have 100 million of these things to look at every second. And it turns out the computers can find these things, but you need a lot of computing power to do that. There's another kind of thing we want to look for, pulsing signals. And here I've circled a bit, which you can, it's actually, if I remove the circles from those 5 dots, it's actually very hard to find with your eye, but computers can do that if you have a big supercomputer. So some of you might remember this project. We call it SETI Home, where we, instead of having a dedicated supercomputer we used volunteers if they have a home computer or a computer at their office or a cell phone that can do computing for us. So what we did is we recorded the data at the Arecibo Observatory, a couple petabytes of data, and then we broke it up so everybody got a different part of the sky. And you run a screensaver program, the SETI Home Screensaver, which is a program you download on your home computer or your cell phone. And then everybody got assigned a little piece of the sky to work on. And you would work on that piece of the sky, or your computer would work on that, looking for all kinds of different signals. It would take a couple days, and then it would connect on the internet, send the results back, anything interesting that it found. And if you find something interesting, your name is attached to the data. You might share the Nobel Prize with me, of course. But, and we had 8 million people sign up for this project. It was the biggest. It was the most sensitive search that Earthlings have ever done. And we were able to look for all kinds of signal types that we've never been able to do, just because of all these volunteers that helped us have the most powerful supercomputer on the planet. Was anybody here old enough to participate in this project? All right, thank you very much. You built the most sensitive search ever done on the planet. We didn't find ET, but we're getting there. So thank you for doing that. So we didn't find ET, but I want to tell you about some of the spin-offs that have happened so far. One was that we worked with Lawrence Hall of Science up the hill here to develop a curriculum for kids. Kids are really interested in this question, are we alone? It's a great question for them because it touches on you can get them interested in astronomy and biology and evolution, all these different questions in the direct equation. You can talk about sociology and politics. Are we gonna blow ourselves up? Is climate change going to get us in? That question, are we alone, touches on so many different subjects. And it's a good way to get kids interested in all these different things. And then we developed, the other kind of spin-off was we developed this thing where you could participate, you could use your home computer or your cell phone, not just to do SETI, but in lots of different projects. And now there's about 100 different projects that you can use your home computer. We call it volunteer computing or distributed computing. There's astronomy projects, there's biology projects, there's COVID. You can look for COVID-19 therapeutics, cancer drugs, HIV drugs, gravitational waves. You pick your favorite project. There's climate change projects, and you can call it the democratization of scientific supercomputing. You pick your favorite projects. You can allocate. You can say you want 30% of your spare computing cycles to look for gravitational waves and 40% for COVID-19 drugs. This is climate change. This is gravitational waves. This is looking for evaporating black holes. This is protein folding. And there's a lot of projects. And we also started doing these citizen science projects where people, these are things where computers aren't very good, but people are good at it. We did this thing called Stardust at Home, where we're trying to look for learn how the planets formed, and people using their eyes to run a virtual microscope. And now there are a lot of these citizen science projects. The other thing I mentioned briefly was another spin-off is the instruments that we developed to do SETI. It turned out they're very powerful kind of signal processing, high-speed computing kind of things. And they were used all over astronomy. They made the first images of the black hole. They discovered fast radio bursts. They discovered most of the known pulsars are discovered on the SETI equipment. A planet made out of solid diamond. They recently made this discovery just a month ago about the gravitational wave background from black hole binaries going around, and timing these pulsars could measure the whole fabric of space moving around. They've been used outside of astronomy a little bit to do medical research, looking at how the brain works. Eventually, we think they'll be used to kind of get data out of your brain to control prosthetic arm. We're working on that with some people. Another big spin-off is we've had a lot of students that get trained on SETI, and those skills that you learn in computers, electronics, and astronomy and instrumentation are useful in a lot of different things. And we've had some students that have gone on to do kind of amazing things. Not all, but it's a fun thing to work on. Okay, so I want to switch topics now and talk a little bit about where we're going, where our group is going, and where SETI is going in the long run. So we're not asking the volunteers to do SETI at home anymore because that Arecibo telescope collapsed. But we're now using an even bigger telescope that's in China called the FAST telescope. Arecibo is 300 meters. This is a 500-meter telescope, the world's largest radio telescope. And we're using it to follow up on the best SETI at home candidates. So we the volunteers helped us kind of figure out what looks interesting, and some things we've picked out about 200 things that we want to check up on, and we're using this telescope. We got some dedicated time so we can point the telescope and look at these things that we think are interesting and see if they're really sending radio signals from another civilization. We're also doing a big sky survey there. We're just raster scanning the sky, and not just looking at the most interesting things on the sky. Another thing that Earthlings are working on, this doesn't exist yet. There's a prototype in South Africa called Meerkat, but this is a thing that it's a big international project called Square Kilometer Array to build it. Instead of building a big dish like the one I just showed you, you can build a big dish out of lots and lots of little dishes. And I think that's kind of the future of telescopes, is to combine lots and lots of telescopes. You can stamp them out like hot dogs. And there are a lot of advantages, not just cheaper, but you can cover bigger chunks of the sky. There are a lot of scientific advantages. And so right now, there's I think 70 of these telescopes in South Africa. South Africa got a big desert. It's very quiet there, radio quiet, not much pollution, radio pollution. And so, and Australia has another prototype that they're building. And both of these telescopes, the prototypes are working. And now we're trying to get all these countries to work together to build a big thing, the Square Kilometer Array. Another thing that we're working on, this is a project that's at Berkeley together with UC San Diego and Caltech and Harvard, something called PANOSETI. And this is optical SETI, looking for laser signals. And it's called PANOSETI. And we want to look at a big chunk of the sky all at once. And this doesn't exist yet, but the idea is to build a kind of clamshell dome. And we've got some prototypes at Lick Observatory. We've got 3 of these telescopes, but the idea is to build this thing, and you have a bunch of telescopes in there, each one looking at a different part of the sky. Each one looks at about 100 square degrees, but if we have 100 of them, we can look at 10,000 square degrees, a big chunk of the sky at once. So we've done this before, where we could look at a little tiny part of the sky before using conventional telescopes at Lick Observatory, and we could look at one star at a time. But the problem is, if you're looking there, and this guy's giving you a little flash of light, you're going to miss it. And our telescope right now is like looking through a soda straw that's 30 feet long. It just looks at a millionth of the sky. So if you can see this animation, you can see we're kind of spending 10 minutes on that star, then 10 minutes of that star. But we're likely, if the flash is only once a week or once a month or once a year, we're never going to find them this way. So we're trying to figure out how to build this all sky, all the time thing. And we got some new detectors that they're finally cheap because they're used in medical imaging, positron emission tomography, PET scans machine. And so we can kind of tile the sky with these things. And we use these cheap lenses, the Fresnel lenses, that are $100 for a pretty big telescope, 0.5 meter, 18 inches across. And these are these detectors that they're photon counting detectors. What's really cool about them is that they can image the sky every billionth of a second. So we can make a movie that's 1 billion frames a second and look for these very short flashes of light. So it's like looking for kind of lighthouse flashes. The idea is that like a lighthouse works, they're not on all the time, but when they flash, so if you save up energy for a while, then you still put it all into a short burst, you can make a really bright thing. It's pretty easy. We have lasers that'll outshine our sun, but they're only on for a short time, then it doesn't take much energy. So we're looking for these flashes. This is our production telescope. There's a couple of the telescopes at Lick Observatory. If you went up there, you could see the new telescopes that we're starting to use. This thing doesn't exist yet. That's the thing we want to build. We're trying to raise money for that now to build the big thing. The reason I'm kind of excited about this is that we're exploring a kind of new parameter space, something that's largely explored. Astronomers typically, when they take a picture of the sky, they open the shutter for a long time. You expose for minutes or hours. And if something were flashing on a short time, 1 billionth of a second or 1 millionth of a second or a millisecond, nobody's really looked at the sky on those kind of time scales. And it turns out, we don't understand why, but if you just look at the sky with something that's nobody ever done, in this case, a new time scale, but if you look at the sky at some frequency or wavelength that nobody's observed, or maybe some new size scale or something that nobody's done before, nature seems to populate space with phenomena. So if you just look at something that looks like there's something to be discovered. We don't understand why, but because we're looking at this new time scale, we think there may be some new phenomena that we'll discover. Maybe we won't find ET, maybe we'll find some new astronomical phenomena. It also turns out it turned out to be useful for other kinds of science. These people that are studying these extremely high energy gamma rays that nobody knows where these incredibly high energy petavolt electron volt things come from. We don't understand where they come from. And it turns out they had built these really big telescopes to look for low energy, but if you're looking for the high energy particles, you can use it with a much smaller telescope and they can kind of cover a much bigger chunk of the sky. It's much cheaper than building these great big telescopes, which are designed. It turns out if you want to look for the real high energy, you don't need that big kind of telescope. So they want to use PANOSETI to try to understand these extremely high energy particles. And it turns out it's also useful in this dark matter search. So it turns out there are a lot of big questions in astronomy. One is, are we alone? We've been talking about that. Another question is this thing called dark matter. We have no idea what it is, but it turns out it's most of the matter in our galaxy and other galaxies. And it turns out these people trying to understand what dark matter is want to use the PANOSETI telescope to look for this thing called dark matter annihilation. And it turns out to be more sensitive than anything they've got. So anyway, we're excited about these other uses. So what's happening in our future, we don't know, but what I'm excited about is that the technology is getting better and better. So even though I think Earthlings we're kind of in this primitive, we're just getting in the game, we're just learning how we might communicate with ET, but the telescopes are growing exponentially, doubling every 3.5 years. Computing power, as you know, is going exponentially, Moore's law. We used to listen to 100 channels at once. Now we're listening to 100 billion channels simultaneously. If you kind of look at the timeline where you compress the whole age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years, into one day, we've only been doing SETI for the last 0.002 of a second, and everything's happening in the last millisecond, basically. I think eventually we'll be able to do much bigger experiments. Like you could use our sun as a giant telescope called the gravitational lens, the sun, and then you'd have a telescope the size of the sun. If you could do that, we don't know how to do that, but maybe in 1,000 years or maybe in 100 years we could do that. You get 10-meter resolution on an exoplanet. You could almost read like their license plates. So, okay, I got a few more slides. Couple of my favorite quotes. Phil Morrison said that SETI is the archaeology of the future. And I think what Phil was talking about is that if we ever do find ET, maybe we'll get on the galactic internet. Some of these civilizations are going to be billions of years ahead. We're going to learn their science, literature, poetry, medicine. We're going to learn how they got through their bottlenecks, how they stopped killing each other. So we can learn, there's a lot we could learn if we get on this galactic internet. Carl Sagan said that SETI is profound either way. And what he meant by that was if we get on the galactic internet, that's profound. We're going to learn about kind of this question, are we alone? Is anybody out there? But if we, right now we can't do a thorough search, but if we could do maybe in 100 years, we'll be able to sort of look at all these different wavelengths and look for photosynthesis and look for all kinds of light. If we don't find it, that's also very profound. That means Earth is an incredibly special place. We better take really, really good care of life on this planet. I'm not saying we shouldn't take good care of life on this planet, but it's interesting either way, yes or no, whether there's life or not. Okay, so if you've been asleep, this is kind of a summary slide. I know that some of you come from you're from some class and you get a credit. This is the only slide you have to remember.